Saskatchewan says the province will neither be collecting the federal carbon tax on natural gas nor paying it, a decision which breaks federal emissions law. At the beginning of this year, the province stopped collecting the federal carbon tax from home heating. The province had until today to remit the money from January. Dustin Duncan is the Saskatchewan minister responsible for SaskEnergy, and he joins me now. Minister, it's good to have you here in person. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, David.
You've made this decision. You say you didn't make this decision lightly. What finally convinced you to just stop remitting the carbon tax to Ottawa?
Well, ultimately, what we needed was assurance from the Canada Revenue Agency that they would accept the government of Saskatchewan's application to be the registered distributor and accept SaskEnergy's application to no longer be the distributor, to essentially take the people that work at SaskEnergy, the executives, the staff, the board of directors, basically off the hook for any consequences. We had said initially that we were not going to do this if there was any consequences that would be borne by them of a decision that we would make as a provincial government. And so once we had both of those applications accepted by the CRA, that made the decision that much easier to go ahead with.
Okay, for privacy reasons, the CRA still will not confirm this status change to us. They say they can't, but I take you at your word. Yeah. But I am shocked that they allowed you to do this, because that is not how this legislation is supposed to work. Did you get an explanation as to why they're letting you shift the liability away from SaskEnergy to you and the government?
No, there really wasn't a discussion, certainly not at the political level, with anybody associated with CRA. We submitted an application, as any registered gas distributor that wants to distribute gas in Canada under the Act did. And at the same time, SaskEnergy submitted an application, and both were accepted.
Okay, I get your objection to the carbon tax as a policy. I get the political fight. But this is the law. And you've now announced you're going to break the law. How do you do that as a minister of the Crown for the government of Saskatchewan, defy the law of the government of Canada?
I can tell you it's a decision that I haven't taken lightly. I've been elected for 18 years. I've been a minister in Saskatchewan for the last 15 years. And I've never had to retain personal legal counsel until now. So it is a very serious issue. We don't take it lightly. As you know, we were opposed to a consumer carbon tax from the beginning and took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and we lost that. And so we took our medicine, and we implemented the requirements under the Act, and did so knowing that it was going to be applied as fairly as possible across the country. When the Prime Minister made the decision at the end of October to exempt some Canadians, largely based in Atlantic Canada, and we don't begrudge them for the exemption, we just want to receive the same exemption. This was really about providing that same fairness that the Prime Minister carved out some Canadians, but not all Canadians.
But you are a minister of the Crown.
Yep.
You swore an oath when you went into cabinet to uphold the laws of the country and of the province, and you're not doing that now. I mean, what does that say to the people of Saskatchewan? Can they just ignore your laws if they don't like what the provincial government does?
Well, I certainly wouldn't advise anybody to follow what we're doing, but that's how serious that we take this in Saskatchewan. Again, we opposed the carbon tax, but we implemented what we had to implement under the federal legislation, so long as it was being equally applied across the country. This is not our decision alone. This really was based on the Prime Minister making a decision, really for political reasons, and we understand that, to exempt some Canadians, but not equally exempt all Canadians. So the fastest way for this to be resolved is for the Prime Minister to essentially allow for what he has done for Atlantic Canadians. And again, we don't begrudge them. We just want the same treatment as what was given to Canadians in one part of the country.
It could also be resolved, though, by the government of Saskatchewan following the law of the country of Canada.
Well, essentially, the Prime Minister is allowed a part of the country to not have to follow the law for at least 3 years.
It is a national exemption for home heating oil. I know sure. I'm an Atlantic Canadian. I know it disproportionately affects people in Atlantic Canada, and there are political reasons for this decision. I am not a fool. Yeah. But it is applied across the country. There's actually more people outside of Atlantic Canada who will benefit from the home heating oil exemption than there are in Atlantic Canada. So it is nationally applied, even if it is tilted, just like the agriculture exemptions are tilted to a couple of provinces.
But one of the reasons why we know we lost at the Supreme Court was that the Supreme Court decided in their wisdom that the ability for one province or one region to essentially exempt themselves could go against the actions that were taken by the rest of the country or by the country as a whole. And so that was one of the basis for why we lost at the Supreme Court. The Prime Minister has essentially undercut his own argument in terms of why he actually won at the Supreme Court. So we're just looking for the same treatment as what's being given to many Canadians.
Look, he's made a political choice, and staunch supporters of the policy on the other side of this argument for you come to the same conclusion, that the Liberals have undermined their policy. Yeah. But you're government, and you've got to uphold the law, and you're not doing it now. It says in the Act you can face fines, you can face jail time. I mean, I know people are struggling with the cost of living, but there is a rebate that will probably either be eliminated or drastically reduced by your decision to withhold the revenue, because it's meant to be revenue neutral. I mean, are you prepared to see people go without that money, and are you prepared to pay a fine and go to jail?
Well, I would say on the second part, or on the first part, we know that the PBO, for example, has indicated that most Saskatchewan households will actually pay more in carbon tax than they'll see in a rebate. That's going to go up to about $1,400 by 2030. I think they indicate this year it's about $600. We know on SaskEnergy bills it's about $400 for a household. So we know it's significant. And in fact,
in a year.
In a year. But Stats Canada's inflation numbers, which came out in January, indicated that Saskatchewan's inflation rate dropped to 1.9%, below the Canadian average of 2.9%. And Stats Canada themselves indicated that that's largely based on the fact that we took the carbon tax off of energy bills. So we know that this is an affordability issue, and this is going to help people in Saskatchewan.
Okay, but just
like it's going to help people in Atlantic Canada.
Understood, but it is coming back in Atlantic Canada at a certain point. It's just to allow for a transition.
But the other thing I'll say on that is that we'll see, because in 3 years from now, the carbon tax will be 3 years higher than what it is today. So it'll be close to probably $100 a ton. We'll see if a government is willing to go from zero to about $100 in 3 years from now.
You have the time to get off home heating oil. So you're right, we'll see. So $400 on a house, right? That's what you're talking about here for the home heating. Mm-hmm. That's about $30 in round numbers, $35 a month. A portion of which is rebated. You're willing to risk jail time and fines over a household cost of about $35 that comes with a rebate. Explain the math there.
Well, again, the PBO says that not all Saskatchewan households are going to be treated equally by the rebate. In fact, most households will pay more in carbon tax than they will see in terms of a rebate.
There's some issues with that PBO report, though, in terms of economic assessment and a bunch of different things. So, I take your point, but if it's $400, let's accept that as a cost on an annual basis, divided by 12 months, $35 around numbers, you get a rebate on that, because you're talking about home heating here is what you're talking about. You're defying the law and willing to risk punishment and fine for $30 a month?
And we wouldn't be here if the Prime Minister had just treated the rest of the country equally. When the Prime Minister made his announcement at the end of October of last year, we don't want to be treated like second-class citizens in our own country. We were opposed to the carbon tax, but we implemented what we had to based under the federal legislation because of the principle that people would be treated equally across the country. The Prime Minister has gone back on that, and so we're not willing as a provincial government to not stand by our principles. We don't think that there should be a carbon tax for anyone on anything in the country. But that being said, it was implemented, and it was fair across the country. The Prime Minister broke that fairness.
Right, but there are other premiers who disagree with carbon pricing. They're not prepared to do that this way. I mean, the knock-on effect of a provincial government just blatantly defying federal law. The federal government has powers like disallowance that it can legally use to dismiss provincial laws that it does not use because it is seen as inappropriate in a modern, political and national context. The precedent of you doing this, the knock-on effect of Saskatchewan doing this, threatens how this country is supposed to work.
Well, I would say that started in October when the Prime Minister decided to give a waiver, an exemption for 3 years for part of the country, but not the rest of the country.
That's what elections are for. We have an election coming sometime soon, right? If people don't like this and don't think it's fair, they can get rid of them. They can vote them out, and the polls would suggest that is very likely to happen if an election were held today. So why not win this politically rather than put yourself and your province in a potential legal jeopardy?
Because this is about fairness. We strongly believe that certainly we know in the province of Saskatchewan, the people of Saskatchewan are supporting their duly elected government, and the duly elected legislature of Saskatchewan unanimously amended the legislation of SaskEnergy last fall to essentially allow us to do this. So we're following a mandate that we have from the people of Saskatchewan and by the duly elected legislature of Saskatchewan.
There is an election in your province this year.
Yeah.
You're not running.
That's correct.
Right, but your government is, and so you may bear the burden for this. And Premier Moe may reap the benefit of this politically. I mean, what do you say to people who look at this and say, this is all about an election year? a right-wing party in Saskatchewan hurting you in rural parts of the province, and the New Democrats challenging you in places like Regina and Saskatoon?
Oh, I've been in this party for 18 years. I've been elected for 18 years. I've been in the cabinet for the last 15 years. I can tell you that I'm confident that even if this wasn't an election year, this is the stand that this government would take.
Dustin Duncan, Minister responsible for SaskEnergy. Thanks for your time. Thanks for taking the questions.
Thanks, David.
Okay, since I recorded that interview with Minister Duncan, the federal government has responded. Energy and Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson is calling Saskatchewan's decision reckless and irresponsible.
If you're not collecting the money, it's pretty hard to see how you're going to rebate the money. This is going to impoverish Saskatchewan people, especially those who are vulnerable from an economic perspective, and it is a terrible signal to people across the country that says you can selectively decide which laws you abide by and which you don't.